Some people spend their entire lives trying to avoid exclusion without realizing that exclusion is often the very thing that reveals who they really are. Not success, not praise, not belonging. Exclusion. The moment they are ignored, left out, overlooked, not chosen, not emotionally prioritized. Because most people never build an identity that can survive disapproval. So when acceptance disappears, they disappear with it. And the dangerous part is not the rejection itself. The dangerous part is how quickly the mind turns social experiences into measures of self-worth. One unanswered message becomes self-doubt. One cold interaction becomes insecurity. One exclusion becomes a silent emotional trial. And slowly, people begin negotiating against themselves just to remain accepted. They soften opinions, hide emotions, shrink personalities, over-explain, perform, adapt, monitor reactions constantly. Not because they are weak, but because somewhere along the way, approval became psychological safety. And when approval becomes survival, authenticity becomes dangerous. That is where self-abandonment quietly begins. Quietly, almost invisibly. Most people think emotional strength means confidence in public. But real emotional strength is something far rarer. It is the ability to remain internally stable when external validation disappears. That changes everything. Because once a person no longer depends on constant approval to feel psychologically intact, their entire presence changes. They speak differently, move differently, choose differently, love differently, recover differently. And perhaps most importantly, they stop begging emotionally. Not out loud, not visibly, but internally. They stop asking the world for permission to feel worthy. And this is where social exclusion becomes something most people never imagine it could become. Training. A psychological mirror. A painful but powerful interruption, a forced confrontation with emotional dependency. Because exclusion reveals where identity is externally attached. It exposes emotional addictions most people never notice while life is comfortable. The addiction to being liked, to being reassured, to being included, to being chosen, to being emotionally confirmed by other people. And if this dependence remains invisible, people spend decades trying to earn feelings they were supposed to build internally. That is the tragedy. Some people become highly successful while remaining psychologically dependent on approval, which means even achievement never truly stabilizes them. Because no amount of external recognition can permanently solve internal uncertainty. The validation fades, the praise fades, the reassurance fades. And eventually, they need another emotional hit just to feel secure again. That cycle exhausts people more than they realize, especially emotionally intelligent people, especially sensitive people, especially people who learned early in life that love, safety, or acceptance could disappear unexpectedly. Because once the nervous system links belonging to emotional survival, exclusion no longer feels uncomfortable. It feels like a threat. That is why some people overreact internally to seemingly small social experiences. Not because the moment itself is catastrophic, but because the nervous system remembers something older, something deeper. And this is where most conversations about self-worth become superficial. People say things like, just love yourself, stop caring what people think, be confident. But the mind does not simply detach from validation because someone repeats motivational phrases, especially when the entire identity has been shaped around emotional permission. The deeper issue is not caring what people think. The deeper issue is needing other people's reactions in order to feel emotionally real. That is different. And this is where self-validation becomes one of the rarest psychological skills a human being can develop. Because self-validation is not arrogance. It is not isolation, not emotional coldness, not pretending rejection does not hurt. Self-validation means your worth remains psychologically intact even when approval fluctuates. It means you can experience exclusion without collapsing into self-rejection. That is power. Quiet power. And most people never fully develop it because modern life constantly trains the opposite. Everything encourages external measurement. Social media, status systems, popularity, attention, performance, comparison. People become hyper-aware of how they are perceived while becoming increasingly disconnected from how they actually feel. And eventually, many lose the ability to recognize themselves outside of feedback. That is why silence unsettles them, why being ignored destabilizes them, why exclusion becomes emotionally overwhelming. Because without external reflection, they no longer know how to locate their own value. And slowly, that becomes identity. But here is what most people misunderstand about exclusion. The real damage often happens after the event, not during it. It happens in interpretation. One person experiences exclusion and thinks, "They did not choose me." Another experiences the same moment and thinks, "There must be something wrong with me." That second interpretation changes lives. Because once rejection becomes identity instead of experience, people begin unconsciously organizing their entire behavior around avoiding emotional pain. And this is where people start disappearing psychologically. They become less honest, less expressive, less visible, less spontaneous. Not because they want to, but because self-protection quietly takes control. Most people never notice this shift happening. They simply call it maturity, being realistic, being careful. But often, it is unresolved emotional conditioning disguised as wisdom. And the body keeps score. You can see it in the hesitation before speaking honestly, in the fear of inconveniencing people, in the compulsive need to explain yourself, in the inability to tolerate disapproval, in the exhaustion that comes from constantly managing perception. Because performing acceptance is emotionally expensive, especially when done for years. And this is where exclusion becomes strangely revealing. Because when certain forms of validation disappear, you finally see how much of your emotional stability depended on them. That realization can feel devastating at first, but it is also the beginning of freedom. Because awareness changes the relationship. Once you see the dependency clearly, you stop romanticizing it. You stop calling emotional dependence love. You stop calling approval-seeking kindness. You stop calling self-erasure being easygoing. That changes everything. Now here is where things become more uncomfortable. Many people secretly fear exclusion more than failure. Failure can still contain admiration, effort, recognition, sympathy. But exclusion threatens something deeper. Visibility. Human beings are profoundly affected by social perception because historically, belonging meant survival. To be excluded from the tribe once meant danger. And although modern society has changed, the nervous system still reacts emotionally to social rejection with remarkable intensity. Which explains something many people feel but rarely articulate. Sometimes exclusion hurts physically, not metaphorically. Physically, a tight chest, heavy stomach, restlessness, insomnia, mental replaying, emotional spiraling. Because the brain processes social rejection through systems connected to emotional pain and threat detection. And if someone already carries unresolved insecurity, exclusion amplifies it dramatically. That is why emotionally dependent people often become hyper-vigilant socially. They overanalyze tone, silence, timing, expression, attention. They search constantly for signs of emotional safety. And eventually, life becomes exhausting. Because they are no longer living naturally. They are monitoring constantly. That is not peace. That is psychological surveillance disguised as social awareness. And the deeper problem is harder to see. When people become overly dependent on approval, they stop making decisions based on alignment and start making them based on emotional risk reduction. That is dangerous. Because now the question is no longer, what feels true to me? The question becomes, what minimizes rejection? That subtle shift changes entire lives. People stay silent, tolerate disrespect, hide themselves, fake agreement, and apologize excessively. All to maintain emotional safety. And slowly, the personality fractures. Not dramatically, quietly. That is how people lose themselves. Not through one catastrophic event, but through repeated betrayals against their own inner truth. And here is the irony. The more people abandon themselves to gain approval, the less emotionally stable they become. Because the mind always knows when authenticity is being traded for acceptance. Always, even if others approve. That internal conflict creates anxiety many people cannot explain. A strange emotional fatigue, a sense of disconnection, a quiet resentment toward life. Because deep down, the self knows, I am surviving socially, but disappearing psychologically. That realization hurts. But it also becomes the doorway into real transformation. Because eventually, some people reach emotional exhaustion. They become tired of chasing reassurance, tired of monitoring reactions, tired of shrinking themselves, tired of emotionally negotiating for worth. And this is where self-validation begins. Not as confidence, as recovery. Most people believe self-validation comes from positive thinking. It is not. It is built through repeated moments where you remain emotionally present without external confirmation. That is entirely different. It means tolerating uncertainty without collapsing internally, speaking honestly without needing immediate agreement, existing visibly without constant reassurance. That takes emotional maturity most people never fully develop. And this next part matters deeply. Self-validation does not remove pain. It changes dependency. You still feel rejection, still feel disappointment, still feel grief. But the experience no longer defines your identity. That is the difference. Emotionally dependent people experience exclusion as proof. Emotionally grounded people experience exclusion as information. One collapses inward, the other observes. And that small psychological distinction changes relationships, careers, confidence, limits, and emotional resilience. Because when identity no longer depends entirely on acceptance, fear begins losing control. Slowly, not instantly. This process is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, internal, often invisible to others, which is why many people misunderstand emotional growth completely. They think growth looks like becoming louder. Sometimes growth looks like becoming calmer, more internally anchored, less reactive, less desperate to be understood by everyone. Because self-validation teaches something incredibly powerful. Not everyone's approval deserves authority over your nervous system. That realization alone can change a life. But here is another layer beneath this. Many people seek validation because they never learned how to emotionally witness themselves. Their emotions were dismissed, their reality minimized, their pain ignored, their needs treated as inconvenient. So they learned to search externally for confirmation that their inner world mattered. And this creates a painful psychological pattern. They become emotionally dependent on being emotionally reflected. They need agreement to trust themselves, reassurance to feel safe, recognition to feel real. Without it, self-doubt immediately enters. That is why exclusion can feel psychologically disorienting. It interrupts emotional reflection. And when someone has not developed strong internal validation systems, silence becomes unbearable. Because silence forces confrontation with the self. Most people distract themselves before that happens. They seek noise, attention, interaction, stimulation, anything to avoid sitting alone with unresolved uncertainty. But this is where emotional sovereignty begins. In the moments where no one is validating you and you remain connected to yourself anyway. That is rare. And this is the part most people never fully recover from if they avoid the deeper work. When exclusion repeatedly wounds identity, people often begin constructing personalities around emotional protection. Some become overly agreeable, perfectionistic, emotionally unavailable, performative, or chronically self-sacrificing. Different strategies, same fear. If I become acceptable enough, maybe I will not be abandoned. But the tragedy is this. People who build identities entirely around being accepted often lose the ability to know who they actually are. Because every decision becomes adaptive. Every reaction becomes calculated. Every expression becomes filtered. That creates profound internal exhaustion, especially over time. And eventually, many reach a point where they no longer trust their own emotional instincts. They trust reactions more than intuition. That is dangerous, because external feedback is unstable. Always, people project, misunderstand, withdraw, change, judge emotionally, react impulsively. If your identity depends entirely on how others perceive you, your emotional state becomes permanently vulnerable to instability. And that is not confidence. That is emotional outsourcing. Now here is where things begin shifting. The first real step towards self-validation is not confidence. It is observation. You begin noticing how often your emotions change based on external reactions. A delayed response ruins your mood. A compliment elevates your self-worth. Being ignored changes your energy. Approval creates temporary relief. Once you start noticing these patterns clearly, something important happens. You stop confusing emotional reactions with objective truth. That is powerful. Because most people unconsciously obey emotions without examining the deeper structure beneath them. But emotionally aware, people begin asking different questions. Why does this reaction affect me so deeply? What belief is attached to this moment? Why does exclusion immediately become self-judgment? Those questions matter. Because underneath approval seeking is often a hidden belief. If people stop choosing me, I lose value. That belief silently controls behavior. And until it is challenged consciously, people continue sacrificing themselves for emotional permission. Stay with me, because this next shift matters. At some point, emotionally mature people realize something uncomfortable. Validation feels good, but dependence on validation creates weakness. Not weakness in intelligence, not weakness in capability. Weakness in emotional stability. Because now peace depends on reaction. And anything that controls your peace controls you. That changes everything. Once people truly understand this, they begin reclaiming emotional authority slowly. They stop over-explaining every boundary, stop needing universal agreement, stop trying to make everyone comfortable at their own expense, not aggressively, calmly. And that calmness becomes noticeable. Because emotionally grounded people carry a different energy. Less urgency, less performance, less emotional chasing. They do not collapse every time perception changes. That creates quiet power, and people feel it immediately. Ironically, the less desperate someone becomes for validation, the more naturally respected they often become. Because desperation creates psychological tension. People feel when someone needs approval excessively. It affects communication, presence, limits, decision-making. But people who validate themselves internally move differently. There is less emotional bargaining in their behavior. They can tolerate misunderstanding, disagreement, even temporary exclusion. Not because it feels pleasant, but because identity no longer disintegrates under social discomfort. That is emotional resilience, and it cannot be faked. This is why some people appear calm even during rejection. It is not that they do not feel pain. It is that pain no longer immediately becomes self-condemnation. That distinction is profound. And this is where many listeners may recognize something painful in themselves. Sometimes the deepest exhaustion in life does not come from work. It comes from constantly trying to remain emotionally acceptable, trying to avoid disapproval, trying not to disappoint, trying not to upset anyone, trying to maintain emotional access to other people. That pressure becomes heavy, especially for emotionally sensitive people. Because sensitivity without self-validation often becomes self-erasure. The person feels everything but trusts themselves very little. And eventually, they become emotionally exhausted from constantly adjusting themselves to survive socially. Most people never call it that. But that is what it is. Social survival. And the nervous system becomes trapped in anticipation, scanning constantly for acceptance. That is why some people feel emotionally drained after social interactions, even when nothing bad happened. They were monitoring the entire time. Monitoring expression, tone, approval, reaction, acceptance. That level of subconscious vigilance slowly depletes emotional energy. And here is the deeper truth. The need for constant validation is rarely about ego. It is usually about emotional safety. That changes the conversation entirely. Because now the goal is not to shame the need for validation. The goal is to understand it deeply enough that it no longer controls identity. That is maturity. Real maturity. Not emotional suppression, not pretending not to care, but learning how to remain psychologically connected to yourself even when external reassurance fluctuates. And this process requires something many people avoid: solitude. Not isolation. Solitude. There is a difference. Isolation disconnects. Solitude reconnects. Isolation says, "No one wants me." Solitude says, "I can still hear myself when no one is around." That distinction changes emotional life completely. Because people who never learn solitude often become emotionally dependent on stimulation. They fear silence because silence removes distraction. And without distraction, unresolved insecurity becomes visible. But solitude gradually strengthens internal connection. You begin hearing your own thoughts more clearly, recognizing your own emotional patterns, understanding your own fears without immediately escaping them. And slowly, self-trust begins forming. Not through affirmations, through honesty. Because self-validation is built every time you stop abandoning your own emotional reality just to maintain acceptance. Every boundary strengthens it. Every honest decision strengthens it. Every moment of authenticity strengthens it. And eventually, something profound begins happening. Exclusion stops feeling like total psychological collapse. Sometimes it even becomes clarity. You begin recognizing where relationships were conditional, where belonging required self-erasure, where approval demanded emotional compromise. That realization can feel painful, but also liberating. Because not every form of inclusion is healthy. Some forms of acceptance cost too much internally. That is important to understand. Many people are included socially while emotionally disconnected from themselves completely. That is not belonging. That is performance. Real belonging never requires chronic self-abandonment. And this is where emotionally grounded people become far more selective. Not arrogant. Selective. They stop asking, "How do I get everyone to like me?" and start asking, "Who allows me to remain psychologically intact?" That changes relationships entirely. Because emotionally mature people understand something crucial. Not everyone deserves emotional access to your nervous system. Some people destabilize constantly. Some manipulate approval. Some withdraw affection strategically. Some create chronic uncertainty. And emotionally dependent people often tolerate this far too long because they fear exclusion more than emotional exhaustion. But eventually, growth changes the equation. Peace becomes more important than emotional chasing. That is where limits become natural instead of performative. And this next insight matters deeply. Self-validation is not built when life feels easy. It is built precisely in the moments where external confirmation disappears. That is the training. When you speak honestly and are misunderstood, when you disappoint someone but remain aligned internally, when you are excluded and still refuse to devalue yourself. when approval disappears and identity remains intact. That is where internal authority forms. Quietly, most people stop at surface-level confidence. But deeper emotional strength is the ability to remain self-connected under social discomfort. That is rare, and that rarity changes presence. People who validate themselves internally often appear calmer because their emotional center is less externally managed. They are not constantly oscillating between praise and insecurity. That creates stability, and stability creates trust, which is why emotionally grounded people often influence others without trying excessively. Their presence feels coherent, not performative, and perhaps this is the deeper reason self-validation matters so much. Without it, people become emotionally programmable. Their confidence changes with reactions, their identity changes with feedback, their mood changes with perception. They become psychologically controlled by external conditions they cannot fully control. That creates chronic anxiety, because public perception is unstable by nature, always changing, always shifting. No human being can maintain permanent approval, which means any identity built entirely on acceptance eventually becomes fragile. And this is where many people spend years trapped, trying harder, performing more, seeking greater recognition. While never addressing the deeper issue, their emotional stability was outsourced from the beginning. But here's the paradox. The moment people stop desperately trying to prove worth, they often become far more emotionally powerful. Because now, their actions are no longer fueled entirely by fear. They create more honestly, speak more clearly, love more cleanly, leave unhealthy dynamics sooner, and live more authentically. That is freedom. Not the absence of pain, the absence of emotional captivity. And if you have experienced exclusion deeply, you already understand something many people do not. You understand how quickly the human mind can begin questioning itself, how silence can become self-doubt, how distance can become insecurity, how being overlooked can become identity. But now you also have the opportunity to understand something else. Exclusion can either fracture identity or refine it. That depends entirely on whether the experience pushes you towards self-rejection or self-awareness. That changes everything. Because exclusion forces a question many people avoid for years. Who are you when no one is confirming your value? That question is uncomfortable, but transformative. And the people who eventually become emotionally sovereign are not the people who never experienced rejection. They are often the people who finally stopped allowing rejection to define them. That is different. Very different. They stopped interpreting every exclusion as evidence of inadequacy. They learned to separate experience from identity. And once that separation becomes stable internally, life changes profoundly. Because now criticism becomes information instead of annihilation. Disagreement becomes tolerable. Silence becomes survivable. Temporary exclusion no longer destroys self-worth. That creates emotional freedom most people spend entire lives searching for externally. And perhaps the most powerful shift of all is this. You stop needing constant proof that you deserve to exist fully. You stop asking every room for emotional permission. Stop negotiating your worth internally. Stop shrinking yourself preemptively. You become more honest, more grounded, more emotionally clear, not because everyone suddenly approves of you, but because your relationship with yourself becomes stronger than your fear of exclusion. That is self-validation, and no amount of external praise can replace it. Because praise without self-trust still leaves people emotionally unstable. But self-trust changes everything. Even silence feels different. Even solitude feels different. Even rejection feels different. Because now there is an internal voice strong enough to remain present when validation disappears. And that voice becomes home. Most people search for belonging externally before learning how to belong to themselves internally. That reversal creates enormous suffering, because no relationship can permanently stabilize a person disconnected from themselves. No audience, no partner, no achievement, no social status. Eventually, every external source fluctuates. And when it does, unresolved dependence becomes visible again. That is why self-validation is not just emotional advice. It is psychological infrastructure. Without it, identity becomes unstable under pressure. With it, people become far more resilient, authentic, and internally calm. Not emotionless, stable. And stability changes how life feels. You recover faster, fear less, attach more consciously, leave unhealthy situations sooner, speak more clearly, and stop over-negotiating your existence. That quiet shift becomes visible in everything. Because self-validation changes the relationship between you and discomfort. You no longer interpret every difficult social moment as evidence against your worth. Sometimes exclusion simply reveals incompatibility. Sometimes it reveals projection. Sometimes it reveals immaturity in others. Sometimes it reveals that you are finally outgrowing environments built around performance instead of authenticity. That realization can feel lonely initially. But loneliness and self-abandonment are not the same thing. Many people are surrounded socially while emotionally disconnected from themselves completely. And many emotionally grounded people experience solitude without feeling psychologically abandoned. That distinction matters deeply, because one of the final stages of emotional maturity is realizing that inclusion alone does not create peace. Alignment does. You can be admired and internally fractured, accepted and emotionally exhausted, validated and still deeply insecure. But once self-validation begins strengthening, a different kind of peace emerges. A quieter one. Less dependent on applause, less dependent on reassurance, less dependent on constant emotional reflection from others. And strangely enough, this often makes relationships healthier too. Because now, connection is no longer built entirely around emotional dependency. There is less clinging, less fear, less over-monitoring, less hidden desperation beneath communication. Love becomes cleaner when identity no longer depends entirely on being chosen. That changes everything. And this is where many people finally understand the hidden gift inside exclusion. It interrupts illusion. It reveals attachments, dependencies, unresolved fears, fragile identities, emotional outsourcing. Painfully, but honestly. And honesty is where transformation begins. Not comfortable honesty. Real honesty. The kind that forces you to confront where your worth has been unconsciously placed. Because whatever controls your sense of worth eventually controls your behavior. Always. If worth depends on praise, approval, or inclusion, fear begins controlling authenticity. But when worth becomes internally rooted, something extraordinary happens. You stop negotiating yourself away, quietly, naturally, not because you become hardened, but because your nervous system no longer panics every time acceptance fluctuates. That is emotional freedom. And perhaps this is the deeper transformation social exclusion can offer when approached consciously. Not bitterness, not superiority, not emotional withdrawal. Clarity. The clarity to recognize where you were abandoning yourself. The clarity to see how deeply fear shaped behavior. The clarity to realize that approval was never supposed to become identity. And once that becomes visible, self-respect grows differently. Not loudly, calmly. Like a person slowly returning to themselves after years of emotional negotiation. And eventually, you become someone who can walk into a room without desperately needing the room to confirm your value first. That presence feels different because there is less emotional hunger inside it, less silent pleading, less fear-based adaptation, less psychological dependence on reaction. And people feel that. Not because you demand attention, but because emotional self-possession changes energy. It changes eye contact, voice, limits, decisions, relationships, everything. Most people spend years trying to become more impressive. But the deeper transformation is becoming less emotionally controlled by perception. That is true psychological strength. Not domination, not arrogance. Internal steadiness. The ability to remain psychologically connected to yourself while the external world fluctuates around you. That is rare. And perhaps that rarity is exactly why exclusion can become such powerful training. Because every moment of exclusion presents a hidden choice. Collapse into self-rejection or strengthen internal authority. Most people are never taught that choice exists, so they internalize rejection automatically. But once awareness enters the process, exclusion loses some of its unconscious power. Now it becomes information instead of identity. And information can be processed calmly. That changes recovery completely. Because emotionally grounded people do not avoid all pain. They simply stop converting pain into permanent self-condemnation. That is the shift. And once that shift stabilizes internally, life becomes lighter. Not perfect. Lighter. You stop carrying the exhausting burden of trying to earn emotional permission in every room you enter. You stop needing every interaction to confirm worth, every conversation to validate identity, every relationship to prove significance. You become more internally anchored. And from that place, something beautiful begins happening. You finally start living from truth instead of fear. Not perfectly, not constantly, but increasingly. And that changes the quality of an entire life. Because the people who experience the deepest peace are rarely the people who receive universal approval. They are usually the people who learned how to remain whole even without it. That is the rare skill. Self-validation. And once it becomes strong enough internally, exclusion no longer feels like the end of yourself. It simply becomes another human experience passing through a mind that finally knows its own value. But there is another layer most people never fully examine. Many people do not fear exclusion because they fear being alone. They fear exclusion because they fear what exclusion might reveal. That perhaps they are not important enough, interesting enough, desired enough, valuable enough. And once that fear becomes emotionally embedded, people begin living defensively. Not openly, defensively. They avoid risks that might expose them, avoid honesty that might create tension, avoid visibility that might invite criticism. And eventually, entire personalities become structured around emotional protection. That is one of the quietest forms of suffering. Living a carefully managed version of yourself because rejection feels psychologically catastrophic. Most people never say this aloud. But many spend years unconsciously asking, what version of me is most acceptable? That question reshapes identity. And the longer someone lives from that question, the more disconnected they become from authenticity. Because authenticity cannot survive under constant emotional editing. At some point, the self becomes exhausted. And this is why some people eventually reach a strange emotional crossroads. Externally functional, internally disconnected, socially accepted, psychologically tired. Because acceptance gained through self-abandonment never creates real peace. The nervous system always knows when belonging required performance. Always. That tension accumulates over time. And eventually, people begin feeling emotionally invisible even while surrounded by others. Because they are being accepted for a version of themselves that is heavily filtered. That loneliness cuts deeply. Not because nobody is around, but because the real self rarely feels fully present. And this is where exclusion can unexpectedly become transformational. Because exclusion interrupts performance. When validation disappears, people are often forced into confrontation with themselves. Painfully, but honestly. And honesty is where emotional rebuilding begins. Not the polished version, the real version. The version underneath adaptation, underneath approval seeking, underneath emotional performance. Most people spend years trying to become more accepted. Very few spend years trying to become more internally aligned. But alignment changes emotional life in ways approval never can. Because alignment creates internal coherence. Your words begin matching your emotions. Your limits begin matching your values. Your decisions begin matching your truth. That creates psychological stability. And stability is incredibly attractive. Not performative confidence. Real stability. The kind that allows someone to disagree without collapsing, to be misunderstood without panicking, to be excluded without self-destruction. That kind of person moves differently through life. And here is the irony most people never expect. The more emotionally independent someone becomes, the more genuinely connected they often become in relationships. Because now, connection is no longer driven entirely by fear. It becomes voluntary instead of desperate. That changes love, friendship, communication, presence. Everything becomes cleaner. Less manipulation, less hidden dependency, less emotional bargaining. And perhaps this is why emotionally grounded people often appear calmer. Not because they feel less, but because they are no longer emotionally drowning inside every interaction. That is different. Emotionally dependent people often experience relationships as emotional survival systems. Every interaction carries enormous psychological weight. A delayed text can feel threatening. A cold tone can feel destabilizing. Distance can feel catastrophic. Not because they are irrational, but because emotional security has become externally located. And when security is externally located, uncertainty becomes exhausting. That is why so many people secretly live in emotional anticipation, waiting for reassurance, waiting for confirmation, waiting for emotional proof that they are still valued. That waiting drains life, because peace becomes conditional. And conditional peace is fragile peace. But here is where emotionally mature people begin separating themselves. They stop demanding that every moment resolve uncertainty immediately. They become capable of sitting with emotional discomfort without immediately spiraling into self-rejection. That is enormous psychological growth. Because emotionally immature minds seek immediate relief. Emotionally mature minds develop tolerance. Tolerance for ambiguity, tolerance for silence, tolerance for temporary misunderstanding, tolerance for emotional discomfort. That tolerance creates resilience. And resilience creates freedom. Because now emotions are experienced without becoming dictators. That changes internal life profoundly. Most people are not destroyed by exclusion itself. They are destroyed by the meaning they attach to it repeatedly. That means I am unwanted. That means I am forgettable. That means I do not matter. Those interpretations become psychological poison over time, especially when repeated for years. And eventually, people begin anticipating rejection before it even occurs. That anticipation changes behavior. They hold back emotionally, avoid visibility, remain guarded, understate themselves. Not because they lack value, because they fear pain. And this is where many people unknowingly create the very emotional disconnection they fear most. Self-protection slowly prevents genuine connection. That is tragic, but also understandable. Human beings naturally protect wounds. The problem is when protection becomes identity. Because eventually, emotional armor becomes emotional imprisonment. And people forget how to exist naturally. Everything becomes management, control, prediction, prevention. That creates enormous internal tension, especially for highly self-aware people. Because they feel the gap between who they are and who they perform. That gap hurts. And eventually, some people become exhausted enough to stop performing constantly. Not because they suddenly become fearless. Because exhaustion finally outweighs fear. That moment matters. Because many forms of transformation begin when emotional fatigue becomes unbearable. The person realizes, I cannot spend the rest of my life negotiating my worth through reactions. That realization becomes a turning point. Not dramatic, quiet, but life-changing. Because now the focus slowly shifts inward. Not toward ego, toward self-connection. And this is where people begin rebuilding internal authority. Very slowly. One honest decision at a time. One limit at a time. One moment of self-respect at a time. The process rarely feels glamorous. Often it feels uncomfortable. Because emotional dependency creates habits. The habit of checking reactions. The habit of seeking reassurance. The habit of over-explaining. the habit of abandoning instinct. Breaking those patterns can feel emotionally unnatural initially, especially if someone spent years surviving through approval. But eventually, a new experience begins emerging. Relief. Relief from constant performance. Relief from emotional hypervigilance. Relief from trying to maintain universal acceptance. That relief becomes addictive in the healthiest possible way. Because peace finally stops depending entirely on other people's moods. And this is where people often discover something surprising. Many of the things they called love were actually fear. Fear of losing access, fear of abandonment, fear of disapproval, fear of exclusion. That is painful to realize, but necessary. Because fear-based attachment creates emotional instability. Real connection requires freedom, not emotional captivity. And freedom becomes possible when identity no longer collapses under uncertainty. That is why self-validation changes relationships so dramatically. It allows people to stop emotionally clinging. Not because they stop caring, because they stop treating every emotional fluctuation like a threat to survival. That creates healthier communication. Less panic, less overreaction, less emotional bargaining, and people feel safer around emotionally grounded individuals. Because grounded people do not constantly demand emotional rescue. They can hold themselves. That is powerful. Not loud power. Steady power. And perhaps this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of emotional intelligence. Emotionally intelligent people are not people who never feel pain. They are people who can feel pain without abandoning themselves inside it. That changes recovery. It changes resilience. It changes identity. Because now, difficult experiences become information instead of permanent definitions. And this is where exclusion becomes transformative instead of destructive. It stops functioning purely as emotional injury and begins functioning as revelation. Revelation of where identity depends on validation, fear controls authenticity, and emotional dependency shapes behavior. That awareness becomes liberating, because once dependency becomes visible, change becomes possible. Most people never truly examine what controls them emotionally. They simply react automatically. Approval creates temporary elevation, disapproval creates collapse, and life becomes an exhausting emotional roller coaster. But emotionally mature people gradually stabilize internally, not because external experiences stop affecting them, because external experiences stop defining them completely. That is the shift. And this next part matters deeply. Many people think self-validation means convincing yourself you are amazing constantly. It does not. That often becomes another performance. Real self-validation is quieter, more grounded. It means acknowledging your emotional reality honestly without requiring unanimous agreement. It means trusting your perception without demanding universal confirmation. It means recognizing your worth without needing constant applause. That is maturity, and maturity creates emotional steadiness. Because now, self-worth is no longer being rebuilt from scratch every single day based on reactions. It becomes more stable, more rooted. And once that rooting strengthens, exclusion loses much of its power to psychologically destabilize. It may still hurt, but it no longer destroys identity. That difference changes everything. Because life inevitably includes rejection, misunderstanding, disappointment, distance, loss. No one escapes those experiences completely. The real question is whether those experiences become temporary emotions or permanent self-concepts. Emotionally dependent people often fuse experience with identity. I was rejected becomes I am unworthy. I was ignored becomes I do not matter. That fusion creates suffering, but emotionally grounded people slowly learn separation. An experience happened, but the experience is not the entirety of the self. That distinction creates enormous psychological freedom, and freedom changes presence. People who are no longer terrified of exclusion often become more authentic naturally. Not performatively authentic, calmly authentic. They stop shaping every sentence around possible approval, stop shrinking to maintain comfort, stop apologizing for existing visibly, and that creates a different kind of confidence. Not loud certainty, internal congruence. The feeling that your external behavior and internal truth are finally beginning to align. That alignment feels peaceful. Because fragmentation is exhausting. Pretending is exhausting. Performing is exhausting. Monitoring constantly is exhausting. And eventually, many people realize the greatest emotional relief is not universal acceptance. It is self-respect. Because self-respect stabilizes people differently. It creates limits, clarity, emotional honesty, and perhaps most importantly, it reduces desperation. That changes relationships dramatically. Because desperation distorts behavior. People tolerate disrespect, stay too long, remain silent, ignore intuition. All because exclusion feels more frightening than self-betrayal. But emotionally grounded people slowly reverse that equation. Self-betrayal begins feeling more painful than exclusion. That is growth. Real growth. Not becoming emotionally numb, becoming emotionally aligned. And once alignment strengthens, something remarkable happens. The world stops feeling like a constant emotional courtroom. You stop feeling judged by every silence, measured by every reaction, defined by every disagreement. You begin existing more freely, not perfectly, but more honestly. And honesty creates peace no amount of performance can replicate. Because at the end of the day, the deepest exhaustion often comes from abandoning yourself repeatedly for emotional survival. That cost accumulates, and eventually, many people realize they no longer want relationships, environments, or social systems that require psychological self-erasure. That realization changes standards. You become more selective with energy, more intentional with access, more protective of peace. Not because you become cold, because you finally understand the value of emotional coherence. And perhaps that is the hidden wisdom inside social exclusion. It forces confrontation with where your worth truly lives. Externally or internally. Because whatever your worth depends on will eventually control your emotional life. Always. And if worth depends entirely on approval, peace remains fragile. But when worth becomes internally rooted, something changes permanently. You become capable of existing fully without constant permission. That is freedom. quiet freedom, the kind that does not need constant recognition to remain psychologically stable. And once someone experiences even a small amount of that internal stability, they rarely want to return to emotional dependency again. Because self-validation creates something external approval never can. Inner steadiness. The ability to remain connected to yourself even while life fluctuates around you. That steadiness changes how rejection feels, how solitude feels, how relationships feel, how existence itself feels. Because now the self is no longer constantly at war for emotional legitimacy. And that may be one of the deepest forms of peace a human being can experience. Not universal acceptance. Internal permission. The permission to exist honestly, speak honestly, feel honestly, live honestly, without requiring constant confirmation that you are allowed to. And eventually, you become the kind of person who no longer collapses every time the world becomes uncertain. Not because you are fearless, but because your relationship with yourself has become stronger than your fear of exclusion. That is the transformation. Not becoming untouchable, becoming internally anchored. And once that anchor exists, social exclusion loses the ability to define you completely. It simply becomes another human experience passing through a mind that finally knows how to remain connected to itself. That is where self-respect begins. That is where emotional freedom begins. And for many people, that is where life finally begins feeling like their own.